October 13th, 1859, Nathan of New Orleans, born in the tobacco fields of Virginia. At age 12, he watched his father beaten to death for looking a white woman in the eye. At 16, he was sold downriver to the Marchand plantation in New Orleans, separated forever from his younger sister. At 22, he married Sarah in a quiet ceremony behind the slave quarters. But Master Henri Marchand had other plans for Sarah. Night after night, Nathan heard his wife's screams from the big house. He pretended to sleep. He pretended not to see the bruises. For 3 years, he swallowed his rage like poison. But on October 13th, 1859, when Sarah didn't return from the house and her blood was found on the master's bedroom floor, Nathan walked into Marchand's study with a cane knife. He pinned the master's hands to his mahogany desk and severed them at the wrists. "These hands will never touch another woman," he whispered, as Marchand's screams echoed through the mansion. Nathan vanished into the bayous that same night. Some say he became a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Others claim he still haunts the plantation, protecting enslaved women from their masters. But every overseer in Louisiana knew one thing for certain: cross Nathan Beauregard's path, and you'd lose more than just your hands. Welcome to Echoes of Truth, where we gather the bravest souls who dare to uncover the stories history tried to bury. I'm about to take you into the darkest corners of antebellum New Orleans, where the real horror wasn't the obvious brutality. It was the systematic destruction of human souls, and what happened when one of those souls refused to stay broken. Do you have the courage to hear what really happened in the shadows of the bayou? If you're ready to join this investigation, hit that subscribe button and comment your location below. Because tonight, we're going to discover how one man's act of love became the South's most terrifying legend. I want you to picture New Orleans in 1859, not the romantic version you've seen in movies, but the real city that existed beneath the Spanish moss and wrought iron balconies. The air was thick with humidity and the stench of human misery, where the smell of jasmine couldn't quite mask the odor of blood and sweat from the slave markets. The French Quarter's elegant mansions stood like beautiful tombstones, each one built on a foundation of unspeakable cruelty. This was a city where human beings were bought and sold like livestock, where the morning newspapers advertised fine breeding stock alongside advertisements for silk and sugar. The cobblestone streets echoed with the sounds of chains, and every sunset brought fresh horrors to the plantation houses that dotted the Mississippi River like cancerous growths. This was the world Nathan Beauregard was born into, a world designed to break him from the moment he drew his first breath. Henri Marchand was exactly the kind of man who could commit atrocities and still sleep soundly in silk sheets. To New Orleans society, he was a pillar of respectability, a third-generation plantation owner, member of the French Opera House Board, and regular attendee at St. Louis Cathedral. He wore tailored suits from Paris, spoke in cultured tones about literature and philosophy, and donated generously to local charities. His neighbors saw him as a gentleman of impeccable breeding, the kind of man who would tip his hat to ladies and never raise his voice in polite company. But I want you to understand something crucial about men like Henri Marchand. Their respectability was their most dangerous weapon. It was the perfect camouflage for a predator, allowing him to commit horrors that would make hardened criminals recoil in disgust. Behind those kind eyes and gentle smile lived a monster who viewed human beings as his personal playthings and who had spent years perfecting the art of breaking souls while maintaining his reputation as a Christian gentleman. The official story was as elegant as it was evil. Henri Marchand was simply a benevolent master who believed in the proper care of his property. He provided his slaves with adequate housing, regular meals, and even allowed them to marry within the plantation boundaries. To visitors and business associates, this looked like progressive plantation management, a humane approach to an unfortunate but necessary institution. Marchand would proudly show guests through his slave quarters, pointing out the relatively clean conditions and the small garden plots he allowed families to maintain. He'd speak passionately about his responsibility to provide moral guidance to his charges, often quoting scripture about masters treating their servants with kindness. Local newspapers even featured articles praising his innovative approaches to plantation management, particularly his decision to keep families together whenever possible. This carefully constructed image served a dual purpose. It earned him social status among his peers while providing perfect cover for what he was really doing. After all, who would suspect such a godly, progressive man of systematic sexual violence? Now, you have to understand, what happened at the Marchand plantation wasn't the work of one sick individual. It was part of a carefully orchestrated system that existed across the entire South, a network of shared practices and unspoken agreements among plantation owners. There were informal meetings held in the back rooms of gentlemen's clubs where masters would share techniques for controlling their human property. They had their own twisted code of conduct, their own methods for breaking rebellious spirits while maintaining plausible deniability. The plantation houses themselves were designed with this horror in mind: soundproof rooms, hidden passages, and strategic layouts that allowed masters to conduct their business without interference. Local doctors provided medical care that prioritized the master's interests over the slave's well-being, while lawyers crafted legal documents that made resistance virtually impossible. Even the churches played their part, preaching sermons about obedience and submission that were specifically designed to crush any hope of rebellion. This wasn't random cruelty. It was an industrialized system of psychological and physical torture, refined over generations into a machine for destroying human dignity. When slaves showed signs of physical trauma or psychological breakdown, there were always convenient explanations ready at hand. Depression was attributed to natural melancholy, inherent to the African temperament. Physical injuries were blamed on clumsiness or fights among the slaves themselves. Pregnancies resulting from rape were dismissed as evidence of the slaves' loose moral character. Even when slaves exhibited clear signs of severe trauma, mutism, violent outbursts, or complete withdrawal from reality, plantation doctors had medical explanations that conveniently absolved the masters of any responsibility. They diagnosed mysterious ailments like fixed melancholy or moral insanity, conditions that supposedly prove the inherent inferiority of the African mind. Local newspapers would occasionally report on these cases, always framing them as evidence of the master's burden in caring for such difficult and unstable people. This medical gaslighting served to isolate victims even further, making them question their own sanity while providing perfect legal cover for their tormentors. It was a system so thorough, so complete, that even the victims sometimes believed the lies they were told about themselves. Dr. Auguste Thibodeau was the kind of man who could perform medical examinations on rape victims and somehow never see any evidence of assault. As the plantation's resident physician, he made weekly visits to treat everything from broken bones to difficult births, all while maintaining a careful blindness to the true source of his patients' injuries. Thibodeau had built his entire practice around this willful ignorance, developing a reputation as a discreet professional who understood the delicate nature of plantation management. He carried a leather medical bag filled with laudanum and morphine, not to ease suffering, but to keep victims docile and compliant. His medical records were masterpieces of creative documentation, full of vague diagnoses and mysterious ailments that explained away everything while revealing nothing. Local authorities trusted his word implicitly, often accepting his testimony without question in the rare cases when investigations were conducted. But Thibodeau's most valuable service wasn't his medical expertise. It was his ability to provide scientific legitimacy to systematic brutality. When he declared that a slave's injuries were self-inflicted or the result of natural causes, it became medical fact. He was the man who turned rape into hysteria and torture into discipline-related accidents. Sarah Beauregard was 23 years old when Henri Marchand first noticed her working in the plantation laundry. She had been born on the plantation, the daughter of a seamstress and a field hand, and had spent her entire life learning to be invisible. Sarah possessed a quiet intelligence that she'd learned to hide behind downcast eyes and whispered responses. She could read, a dangerous skill she'd picked up secretly from discarded newspapers, and had dreams of someday teaching her future children. When she married Nathan in a simple ceremony behind the slave quarters, she believed she might finally build something beautiful in that hellish place. She was gentle with the plantation children, skilled with a needle, and possessed a singing voice that could bring tears to the eyes of even the hardest overseers. But to Henri Marchand, these qualities made her even more appealing as a target. He saw her intelligence as something to break, her dignity as something to steal, her love for Nathan as leverage to ensure her compliance. Sarah represented everything that men like Marchand sought to destroy, proof that enslaved people possessed the same capacity for love, hope, and dreams as any human being. That's what made her destruction so valuable to him, and so devastating to Nathan. 12-year-old Marie Dubois had been invisible her entire life. The mixed-race daughter of a house slave and an unknown father, she existed in the shadows of the Marchand mansion, small enough to slip through spaces that adults couldn't navigate. Her job was to tend the fires in the early morning hours, moving silently through the house while the family slept, and it was during one of these dawn rounds that she witnessed something that would haunt her forever. On that October morning, she had crept into the hallway outside Marchand's study to clean the fireplace when she heard Sarah's muffled pleas coming from behind the heavy oak door. Through the keyhole, Marie saw Henri Marchand pinning Sarah against his desk while she struggled desperately to break free. But what made this moment truly terrifying wasn't just what Marie witnessed. It was the realization that Marchand knew she was there. As Sarah's sobs filled the room, Marchand turned his head slowly toward the door, his eyes meeting Marie's through that tiny keyhole, and smiled. That smile contained a message as clear as words. "You're next." From that moment forward, Marie lived in constant terror, knowing that her accidental glimpse into hell had marked her as Marchand's future victim. She was now living evidence of his crimes, and they both knew it. Marie's transformation was visible to anyone who cared to look, but of course no one did. The bright, curious child who had once hummed while working became a silent ghost who jumped at shadows and flinched whenever an adult approached. She stopped eating regularly, her small body becoming even more skeletal as nightmares robbed her of sleep. When she tried to tell her mother what she had witnessed, she was met with a violent slap and a warning never to speak such lies again. Her mother, Caroline, wasn't cruel. She was terrified. She understood that acknowledging the truth would mean death for both of them, so she chose the only survival strategy available: complete denial. Local authorities showed the same willful blindness when plantation overseer Thomas Reynaud reported Marie's increasingly erratic behavior. Sheriff Baptiste Rousseau attributed her symptoms to the natural instability of mixed blood and recommended that she be watched more carefully to prevent her from spreading malicious rumors. Dr. Thibodeau examined her and declared her mentally deficient, prescribing a regime of hard labor to cure her of fanciful thinking. This systematic denial served multiple purposes. It isolated Marie further while sending a clear message to other potential witnesses about the consequences of speaking truth. When whispers about Sarah's condition finally reached the ears of local authorities, they launched exactly the kind of investigation they specialized in, one designed to fail from the very beginning. Sheriff Rousseau arrived at the plantation with great fanfare, conducting what appeared to be a thorough examination of the allegations. He interviewed Henri Marchand in the comfort of the plantation's parlor, accepting a glass of fine brandy while listening to the master's earnest explanations about the unfortunate tendency of slaves to fabricate stories for attention. Marchand produced Dr. Thibodeau's medical records, which clearly showed that Sarah suffered from female hysteria and delusional episodes that caused her to imagine assaults that never occurred. The sheriff dutifully recorded these findings, even interviewing Sarah herself in the presence of Marchand and the overseer, a setup guaranteed to produce exactly the testimony they wanted. Sarah, terrified and broken, confirmed that she had been having confused dreams and apologized for any trouble her illness might have caused. The investigation concluded within 3 days, with Sheriff Rousseau filing a report that praised Marchand's patience in dealing with such a disturbed individual. The official record showed a concerned master providing medical care for a mentally unstable slave. A perfect example of how the system protected itself through the appearance of justice. This is where the story gets truly chilling, because if you knew what to look for, the evidence was walking around the plantation in broad daylight. Sarah had developed a peculiar way of moving, keeping her body turned slightly away from any man who approached, her hands automatically moving to protect her torso whenever someone spoke to her. She had stopped making eye contact entirely, staring at the ground with an intensity that suggested she was trying to disappear into the earth itself. Her voice had changed too, becoming barely audible, as if she'd forgotten how to project sound beyond a whisper. Other enslaved women on the plantation showed similar signs, a collective flinching, a shared understanding that passed between them in glances and subtle gestures. They moved like people who had learned that survival meant becoming invisible, that drawing attention meant inviting horror. Even their children seemed to sense the danger, playing quieter games and speaking in hushed tones around the big house. But perhaps the most damning evidence was the way these women looked at their own husbands and sons, with a mixture of love and pity that spoke to the impossible position these men found themselves in. They loved men who were forced to stand by helplessly while their wives and daughters were destroyed, and everyone involved understood the terrible mathematics of this arrangement. Let's be real, what Henri Marchand was doing wasn't random violence. It was systematic psychological warfare, refined through years of practice into a precise science of human destruction. He had studied his victims carefully, identifying their emotional vulnerabilities and using them as pressure points to ensure compliance. With Sarah, he had quickly realized that her love for Nathan was her greatest weakness, so he made sure she understood that any resistance would result in Nathan's death. He would describe in graphic detail how he would have Nathan tortured and killed if Sarah didn't submit willingly, forcing her to choose between her own dignity and her husband's life. Marchand kept detailed journals documenting his methods, noting which techniques produced the most complete psychological surrender and which victims showed the most satisfying levels of despair. He had developed a timeline for breaking new victims, usually 3 to 6 months of escalating abuse until they reached what he called complete compliance. The process began with seemingly innocent requests and gradually escalated to full-scale assault, each step carefully calibrated to destroy the victim's sense of agency while maintaining the appearance that they were willing participants. This wasn't the work of a madman. It was the methodology of a skilled predator who had turned human suffering into an art form. Nathan Beauregard was not the man you'd expect to become a legend. At 28, he stood barely 5.5 feet tall, with gentle hands that were more accustomed to kneading bread than wielding weapons. He had learned to read by studying discarded newspapers in the plantation kitchen, and he possessed the kind of quiet intelligence that slave owners either ignored or found threatening. Nathan had survived by becoming indispensable as a cook, developing a reputation for meals that kept even the cruelest overseers in good humor. But beneath his calm exterior burned a mind that missed nothing. He cataloged every routine, memorized every schedule, and noted every weakness in the plantation's security. Nathan's greatest strength wasn't his physical power. It was his ability to remain completely invisible while observing everything around him. He understood that survival in his world meant becoming a perfect actor, playing the role of the content slave, while his true thoughts remained hidden behind careful smiles and downcast eyes. What Henri Marchand never realized was that Nathan had been studying him just as carefully as Marchand had been studying Sarah. While the master saw a broken man pretending not to notice his wife's abuse, Nathan was actually conducting reconnaissance, gathering intelligence for a mission that would require perfect timing and absolute precision. Now you have to understand, Nathan's investigation wasn't conducted with documents and interviews. It was carried out through stolen moments and careful observation, a methodical gathering of intelligence that took place in plain sight. As the plantation's cook, Nathan had access to areas of the house that other slaves never saw, and he used this privilege to study Marchand's routines with the focus of a military strategist. He learned that the master took his evening brandy at exactly 9 o'clock, that he dismissed his personal servant by 10, and that he locked his study door from the inside when conducting his business with enslaved women. Nathan discovered that Marchand kept a loaded pistol in his desk drawer, but that his arthritis made it difficult for him to reach quickly. He observed that the study's windows faced the garden, away from the slave quarters, and that the thick Persian rugs would muffle sounds. Most importantly, Nathan learned that Marchand's confidence in his own security made him careless. He never expected resistance from someone he considered broken. While continuing to perform his duties with apparent normalcy, Nathan was actually conducting the most dangerous reconnaissance mission of his life, gathering the intelligence he would need to turn the plantation's own systems against its master. Can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns truly chilling, where we discover that Nathan's plan wasn't just about stopping Henri Marchand. It was about sending a message that would echo across every plantation in Louisiana, a message so terrifying that it would haunt slave owners' dreams for generations. What I'm about to tell you has been buried in dusty archives and forgotten testimonies, hidden away because it reveals something that those in power never wanted anyone to know. That even in the darkest moments of history, the human spirit can find ways to fight back. But I need to know that you're prepared for this truth, because once you hear it, you'll understand why Nathan Beauregard's name was spoken in whispers for decades after he disappeared. If you're brave enough to continue this investigation with me, make sure you're subscribed to Echoes of Truth, because we're about to uncover evidence that will change everything you thought you knew about resistance in the antebellum South. On the night of October 12, 1859, Nathan made a discovery that transformed 3 years of careful planning into immediate action. While cleaning the study fireplace, he found Sarah's torn dress hidden behind the coal scuttle. Not the dress she had been wearing that morning, but one that had clearly been ripped from her body with violent force. The fabric was stained with blood, and something else that Nathan's experienced eye immediately recognized as evidence of sexual assault. But it wasn't just finding the dress that broke something inside Nathan. It was the realization that Marchand had kept it as a trophy, hidden where he could retrieve it whenever he wanted to relive his crime. This wasn't just evidence of rape. It was proof of a sadistic mind that took pleasure not just in the act of violence, but in its memory. As Nathan held that torn fabric in his shaking hands, something fundamental shifted inside him. The careful plans he had been developing suddenly crystallized into cold mathematical certainty. He finally understood that Henri Marchand wasn't just a rapist. He was a collector of human suffering, and Sarah's dress was part of a collection that probably included trophies from other victims. That night, Nathan didn't go to sleep. Instead, he sat in the darkness of the slave quarters, methodically reviewing every detail of his plan, while that blood-stained dress burned its image into his memory. The sound of Henri Marchand's screams brought the entire plantation to life in ways that Nathan had anticipated and prepared for. As overseers rushed toward the big house, Nathan was already moving through shadows he had mapped months earlier, following routes he had practiced in his mind 1,000 times. He carried nothing but the bloody cane knife and a small bundle of supplies he had hidden in the cypress swamp weeks before. Behind him, lanterns flickered like angry fireflies as search parties formed with military precision. But Nathan had studied their patterns too, and he knew exactly how they would respond to this crisis. The dogs were released within 20 minutes, their howling filling the night air as they picked up his scent and began their relentless pursuit. But Nathan had prepared for this too, carrying rags soaked in pepper and vinegar that he scattered behind him to confuse the animals. He moved through the bayou like a man who had studied every inch of terrain, every fallen log and hidden channel that could provide escape or concealment. The sound of horses and shouting men grew closer, then faded, then closer again as the search pattern tried to anticipate his movements. But Nathan wasn't running randomly. He was executing a plan that would take him deep into the Louisiana swamps, to places where even the most experienced trackers would lose his trail in the maze of waterways and Spanish moss. What happened next reveals the true genius of Nathan's escape, because he didn't run toward freedom. Instead, he circled back toward New Orleans, carrying with him evidence that would expose not just Henri Marchand, but the entire network of plantation owners who shared his crimes. Nathan had stolen Marchand's journal, The detailed record of his experiments in human suffering that included names, dates, and descriptions that implicated dozens of other masters across Louisiana. When he approached the office of L'Union, the French-language newspaper that served New Orleans' free people of color, Nathan thought he was bringing proof that would finally expose the truth. Editor Armand Lanous listened to Nathan's story with growing horror, examining the journal with the eye of someone who understood its significance. But instead of the outrage Nathan expected, he met with something far more terrifying: fear. Lanous explained that publishing such accusations would result in the immediate closure of his newspaper and probable lynching of everyone involved. Even worse, he revealed that several of the names in Marchand's journal belonged to men who advertised in L'Union, men whose financial support kept the newspaper alive. Nathan had discovered not just individual monsters, but a network of complicity that included even those who should have been his allies. The official investigation of the Marchand plantation revealed horrors so profound that even seasoned lawmen, men accustomed to violence, death, and cruelty, were left pale and trembling. Sheriff Rousseau, a man who had seen executions, lynchings, and the aftermath of battle, reportedly staggered when he entered Henri Marchand's private study. What lay before him was not simply evidence of crime, but a museum of perversion. Lined neatly on shelves and in locked cabinets were dozens of personal belongings taken from enslaved women, scraps of clothing, hair ribbons, small trinkets. Each object had been meticulously catalogued, labeled with dates, names, and detailed notations of the crimes it represented. It was as if Marchand had curated a shrine to his own depravity, treating human suffering as trophies. The study concealed even worse secrets. Behind a false wall, investigators uncovered a hidden room that served as Marchand's private torture chamber. The chamber was equipped with heavy restraints bolted to the floor and ceiling, instruments of pain that bore both medical and improvised designs, and a stockpile of surgical tools and chemicals. These were not the implements of a man losing control. They were the carefully chosen tools of someone conducting methodical, prolonged abuse. The room told a story of planning, precision, and cold detachment, turning cruelty into ritual. Equally damning were Dr. Thibodeau's medical records, discovered in Marchand's desk. They revealed the scientific face of the conspiracy, meticulous notes on which drugs rendered victims compliant without leaving fatal traces, which injuries could be convincingly explained away as accidents, and which psychological tactics led to the most complete submission. These notes read less like a doctor's ledger than a grim textbook of human subjugation. In the basement, investigators found narrow cells said to isolate victims during what Marchand chillingly called the breaking period. The spaces were scarcely large enough for a person to lie flat. The walls were scarred with desperate scratch marks, fingernail gouges etched into wood and stone, silent testimony to nights of terror and futile attempts at escape. Most damning of all were the letters exchanged with other plantation owners. Written in coded but unmistakable language, they discussed training techniques and management strategies, phrases that barely concealed their true meaning. The raid revealed not merely the crimes of one man, but evidence of a sprawling network that shared victims, methods, and knowledge across state lines. Marchand was not an anomaly. He was a node in an organized system of horror. The investigation into Henri Marchand's background revealed a man who had been hiding in plain sight for decades, a predator cloaked in the respectability of wealth and lineage. Born into the rarefied world of New Orleans aristocracy, Marchand was the product of privilege from his first breath. His family name carried weight in the city's social circles, opening doors to salons, schools, and sanctuaries where reputation meant more than morality. Yet, even as a child, cracks were visible in the polished veneer. Teachers and servants recalled incidents of cruelty toward animals, younger children, and even household staff. Acts of sadism that were dismissed as boyish mischief by indulgent parents, unwilling to tarnish the family name with unpleasant truths. Those early cruelties, minimized and ignored, foreshadowed the horrors to come. At 25, Marchand inherited his first plantation, and with it, unchecked authority over the lives of dozens of enslaved men and women. The records show a troubling pattern, a series of accidents and suicides, almost all involving enslaved women, that were quietly recorded but never investigated. Standing alone, each case could be written off as tragedy. Viewed together, however, the pattern was undeniable, a trail of calculated brutality hidden beneath the bureaucratic language of death registers. His background in medicine, earned at the prestigious Medical College of Louisiana, gave him not only the technical knowledge of anatomy, but also an understanding of psychology. He weaponized that education, designing methods of torment that left few visible marks, yet inflicted maximum suffering, ensuring that his victims' pain remained largely invisible to outsiders. Marchand's power did not rest solely on fear. His social connections were as carefully cultivated as his cruelty. Judges, politicians, and religious leaders appeared in his correspondence, men who accepted his financial support and social invitations in exchange for silence or direct protection. He was, outwardly, a model of Christian respectability, a benefactor, a host, a patron of the church. But beneath this facade lay something far darker. Investigators found that he had been actively mentoring younger plantation owners, inviting them on what he called educational visits. During these sessions, Marchand demonstrated his techniques on enslaved bodies, transforming torture into instruction. His journals documented not only his own crimes but also chilling accounts of protégés who carried his methods back to their own estates. The man celebrated as a pillar of society was, in truth, the center of a vast web of corruption that extended into every level of Louisiana's power structure. His writings revealed a world where cruelty was not only practiced but systematized, where dozens of respectable men learned from his example and carried his shadow forward. I want you to picture this. The investigation into the Marchand plantation did not just reveal isolated acts of cruelty. It tore open the veil on something far larger, something sprawling and organized, a network that spanned 3 countries and claimed hundreds of victims. What began as an inquiry into one man's atrocities soon exposed a system that resembled a multinational corporation more than a single plantation. Marchand's private correspondence revealed ties to plantation owners in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, each of them participants in a hidden economy of suffering. Even more disturbing were his contacts abroad, wealthy landowners in Cuba and Brazil who engaged in similar practices, linked together in a web of correspondence and shared interests. This was not random brutality, it was coordinated. The network functioned like a business syndicate. Members exchanged resources, trading human beings as though they were commodities, and offered each other specialized services. What they euphemistically described as research was in fact a grotesque series of experiments in psychological domination and physical control. Financial records provided a paper trail of their operations, payments disguised as fees for consulting services and specialty training, which in reality were transactions for lessons in torture. Plantation owners were not just purchasing land or labor, they were buying techniques, perfected methods of cruelty passed along like trade secrets. Most horrifying of all was the realization that the network had documented its crimes with meticulous, almost scientific precision. Investigators uncovered journals, diagrams, and case studies, a library of human suffering carefully compiled to serve as both instruction manual and archive. Victims were discussed not as people, but as experimental subjects, stripped of humanity and reduced to data points. Those letters between members read like laboratory reports, observations about endurance, notes on modifications to techniques, and chilling recommendations for achieving greater compliance. It was cruelty masquerading as scholarship, barbarism presented as progress. The scale of these revelations forced investigators to confront a grim reality. They were not simply documenting isolated abuses of slavery, but something far more systematic, an organized attempt to erase human dignity itself. This was not just bondage for labor, it was an industrialized system for the destruction of body, mind, and spirit. Suffering had been commodified, transformed into both entertainment and profit. And behind it all stood men who called themselves civilized, yet who had built an empire upon the calculated annihilation of the human soul. Now, you have to understand, the most shocking revelation was not merely the extent of the crimes themselves, as horrific as they were. What struck deepest was the sheer number of people who knew about them, who brushed up against the truth and yet chose to remain silent. It was not ignorance that allowed the network to thrive, but complicity. The conspiracy of silence extended far beyond the plantation gates. It wove itself into the fabric of the community, drawing in doctors, lawyers, judges, sheriffs, and even journalists, the very people entrusted with safeguarding justice and truth. These were not passive bystanders. They were active participants in a machine designed to preserve profit and reputation at the cost of human lives. Local newspapers had received anonymous letters, testimonies, and whispered accounts of the atrocities. Editors held in their hands stories that could have shaken the South to its foundations, but those stories never saw print. Instead, they were quietly buried in exchange for advertising revenue from the very families implicated in the crimes. To publish would have meant risking financial ruin and social exile. To suppress meant profit and acceptance. The choice was made again and again until silence itself became a kind of currency. Medical professionals were no better. They documented broken bones, scars, and injuries that could only have been inflicted through systematic torture. And yet, in their official reports, these injuries became accidents, falls, or illnesses. Their expertise was twisted into a shield for the guilty, transforming acts of cruelty into medical fictions. Religious leaders, too, bore witness. They heard confessions whispered in the sanctity of the church, from both perpetrators racked with half-hearted guilt and victims desperate for salvation. But rather than intervene, many chose to preserve the power structures that sustained their own influence. Their silence was framed as discretion, as spiritual duty, when in reality it was complicity. Even in the North, where abolitionist movements fought against slavery, certain leaders shied away from exposing the darkest realities. Specific cases of torture and abuse were known but ignored, deemed too inflammatory or politically damaging to the respectability of the cause. Thus, the conspiracy of silence was not regional but national. It was maintained through bribes, through threats, through social pressure and intimidation. Everyone involved understood the cost of speaking out. To break silence was not only to risk social death, but to invite very real violence upon themselves and their families. And so, silence reigned, louder than screams. Henri Marchand survived Nathan's blade, but survival did not mean victory. He lived the rest of his days as a shattered remnant of the man he once was, his severed hands serving as grotesque reminders of his vulnerability and of the reckoning he had narrowly escaped. Every gesture, every failed attempt to grasp the world around him, was a humiliation that gnawed at his sanity. Within 3 years, he was committed to an asylum in Virginia, where doctors diagnosed him with what they called persecution mania. He spent his final months plagued by the unshakable conviction that Nathan Beauregard was still out there, watching, waiting, ready to return and finish what he had begun. His death in that institution was less an end than an extension of the punishment Nathan had already delivered, proof that fear itself can be as consuming as any physical wound. Others who had enabled Marchand's crimes fared no better. Dr. Thibodeau, the physician whose medical expertise had been twisted into tools of control and suffering, was found slumped in his carriage only 2 months after Nathan's escape. The scene bore the hallmarks of a robbery, yet the untouched money and missing medical bag told a different story, one of deliberate targeting, of retribution cloaked in mystery. Sheriff Rousseau, once a figure of authority, was undone by his own corruption when evidence of his collaboration surfaced. Cast out of office, stripped of influence, he dwindled into a pathetic figure wandering the streets of New Orleans, a drunkard haunted by visions of Nathan's ghost stalking him at every turn. Whether these sightings were the product of alcohol or guilt mattered little. In his mind, Nathan was never far. Marie Dubois, the child whose testimony had threatened to unravel the conspiracy, was quietly erased from the records when she was sold to a plantation in Texas. For years, her fate remained a question mark. But whispers persisted. Survivors traveling along the Underground Railroad spoke of a woman who matched her description. one who guided fugitives through the treacherous bayous, ensuring their freedom at great personal risk. If true, Marie's survival carried forward Nathan's defiance in her own way. As for Nathan himself, he crossed the threshold from man to myth. His name became a story told in hushed voices, a symbol of vengeance and liberation. Sightings of him were reported for decades, always where cruelty reigned, always near plantations whose owners were discovered mutilated, always accompanied by the chilling message, "These hands will never touch another woman." In those words, his legend found immortality. The story of Nathan Beauregard forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about heroism, justice, and the price of resistance. It is not a simple tale of good versus evil, nor one that can be wrapped neatly in the language of morality. Nathan's act of violence, shocking and bloody as it was, saved countless lives by tearing open the veil concealing a vast network of systematic abuse, one that had operated with impunity for decades. His refusal to remain silent and submissive became the catalyst for an investigation that authorities could no longer ignore. That investigation, sparked by his defiance, led to the prosecution of dozens of plantation owners, men who had long thrived in the shadows of law and privilege. It also brought the rescue of hundreds of enslaved people who had been subjected to living conditions so inhumane they could only be described as torture. Yet Nathan's legacy remains complicated precisely because of the methods he chose. His actions were undeniably brutal, methods that many would shrink from even imagining, but the harsh reality is that they proved far more effective than decades of legal petitions, abolitionist writings, and moral appeals that fell on deaf ears. His story illuminates what might be called the terrible mathematics of oppression. The way systematic dehumanization narrows the pathways to justice until violence becomes the only language oppressors are willing to acknowledge. In such a context, the moral question is not whether Nathan's actions were justified in some abstract sense. The deeper, more haunting question is whether a society that allows men like Henri Marchand to rise, thrive, and brutalize others has any standing at all to pass judgment on the desperate measures used to stop them. Nathan's transformation from victim to legend underscores a larger truth about the human spirit. Even in humanity's darkest chapters, resistance emerges, sometimes quiet and hidden, sometimes loud and bloody. His story reminds us that the will to fight back, to protect the vulnerable, to carve a space for dignity, cannot be extinguished by fear alone. Sometimes the greatest act of love is also the most violent, and sometimes true justice arrives not through perfect methods or clean victories, but through imperfect hands that refuse to yield. Nathan's life is proof that resistance, however flawed, can still change the course of history. Could something like this happen today? The unsettling truth is that it already does, often in ways we fail or choose not to see. Human cruelty does not belong to the past. It evolves, adapts, and cloaks itself in new disguises. The systematic abuse Nathan exposed in his own time was not a singular event sealed in history, but a reflection of dynamics that continue to echo through modern societies. The same conditions remain in place: the social invisibility of victims who are hidden in plain sight, the corruption or complacency of authority figures who turn away from cries for help, and the suffocating conspiracy of silence maintained by those who profit, directly or indirectly, from human suffering. It is this silence, this intentional refusal to acknowledge pain, that grants abusers their greatest weapon. And so, the question is not whether we would recognize such abuses today, but whether we would dare to name them once recognized, or whether we would avert our gaze and allow the cycle to continue. The courage Nathan displayed when he refused to surrender, when he placed his defiance and his very life against Henri Marchand's blade, is not merely a story of one man's resistance. It is a parable for the courage required today to confront truths that are as uncomfortable now as they were then. We must ask ourselves, when violence hides behind respectable facades, charitable institutions, government offices, or even religious sanctuaries. Who among us will stand against it? Nathan's legend insists that justice is never freely given. It must be demanded, often at great personal cost. If his story has moved you to think differently about justice, resistance, and the price of silence, then his voice has reached across time to fulfill its purpose. His struggle reminds us that legends are not simply tales of the past, they are calls to action in the present. Subscribe to Echo S of Truth. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment below with your thoughts. What does justice mean when the very system that claims to uphold it is itself corrupt? And stay with us. Next week, we uncover another figure who refused to remain broken. The Witch of Salem, who actually was one. This tale explores a woman whose supernatural powers may have been far more real than history admits, and whose trial revealed secrets so dangerous that the Puritan establishment would rather kill than let them come to light.